Okay, everybody, thank you very much for coming. And we're sorry we don't have a fire, but we can imagine it. Today, I'm going to ask Renée to tell us how she helped build a small Swedish company into the first company to get Food and Drug Administration approval for a product for a rare kidney disease, primary immunoglobulin A nephropathy, followed 6 months later by a takeover bid valued at $1.1 billion. Now, I would say that's a fairly brisk achievement in a very short amount of time. But what happened between the time Renée joined in 2017 and the time the company made its first application to the FDA was quite an interesting story. And it involves a lot of organization, a lot of multiple financing events, taking a controlling interest in a French company that helped build a portfolio. So I'm going to let Renée start and where she would like to begin to tell us what the beginning point of her strategy was and how you built it.
Sure. So as you heard, so actually the disease that we are targeting as a company, we're focused on rare disease, and our lead kind of product candidate really was in IgA nephropathy. And so IgA nephropathy is a rare condition, renal condition, but actually it doesn't start in the kidney. It actually starts in the gut, where we have the majority of our autoimmune system. So this really is a story about a product where we took something, we were focusing something on the origin of the disease. So actually we were not trying to target the kidney directly. We're actually targeting the production of these IgA1 antibodies, which happens in the ileum, which is a distal part of the small intestine. So our kind of product was really a formulation product. And so when I joined the company in 2017, it was a small kind of company, private. I think there were a total of maybe 9 people based in Sweden. And we're going to come on and talk a little bit later about the whole regulatory story. But this was literally just when the FDA, for the first time ever, so this was the cardiorenal division, actually had allowed the company to run a pivotal trial with a completely different endpoint, a novel endpoint that had never been used before. So really, the job was really simple. We just needed to kind of pull together a team that had experience of running large global trials, with actually phase 3. We needed to raise about $80 million to do that. We needed to kind of operate really with the regulatory, both kind of FDA and EMA, to try to actually understand how are we going to actually take this through, and what about accelerated approval, which also the FDA this division had never given an accelerated approval before. So it was a little bit of a kind of slightly daunting task to kind of start out with, but that was really kind of the setup in terms of kind of where I came in to try to kind of set the stage to do that. So really, it was mainly focused on the clinical trial, raising the capital to do that, and really kind of the interactions with the regulator as a beginning.
Now, Renée, you're in an unusual position because you're somebody who's had most of your career until that point in venture capital investment banking. And what did you find was the most challenging thing when you first joined the company? You changed the name, like a lot of new CEOs do. You moved to Sweden.
Yeah.
And brought your family with you. I mean, there are a lot of things that you had to do in order to prepare for the few years ahead, and not even knowing whether it would be a success. So tell us a little bit about those initial years, and some of the structural changes that you introduced besides changing the name of the company.
Sure. So I think in terms of changing the name, this was also, we knew that if we're going to be able to do this and have this journey, we needed to raise a significant amount of capital. So it was pretty clear that at some point in time, you probably would have to kind of become a public company. So the changing of the name was really to try and ensure that we could control our domain and control the name. Mm-hmm. And so that was actually one of the kind of strategic reasons why we wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. In terms of the team, this was obviously, as you all know, biotech, it's really all about the people. So it really was to try and kind of identify and work through the networks. And these were obviously my networks were mainly kind of outside of Sweden. They were mainly kind of in Europe. Mm-hmm. And so this really was a very collaborative effort with, some of the people on the board, some of the people that were there originally, to really kind of try and identify and attract some of the people to come and join this small little company on this pretty daunting journey. But I think the fact that we were very pioneering was one of the attractions for people to join us. So I think that was a key item.
So once you started reorganizing the company, or building it, I should say, is the better word, did you have any input from some of your former colleagues at your former investment banking? In other words, were they helping you with input here at all? Or did you recruit entirely new people?
So I think actually it was recruiting entirely new people, actually. I do think that my background, both in investment banking and in kind of investing, was incredibly helpful in terms of setting kind of the strategy, the longer term kind of financing strategy. And also I think really getting access to a lot of those investors, because I knew the investment kind of environment very well, and I had quite a lot of those connections already. So I think having that access, knowing a lot of those kind of specialist funds, knowing who to call, kind of who to start these kind of conversations with as a kind of small company, I think that was incredibly helpful. So I think from that perspective, it was really helpful. But from a kind of operations perspective, not really.
So when you went to the company, did you have an IPO, which eventually became 2 IPOs, one in Sweden and one in the United States? Did you have that as a vision? I mean, was that something that you were going for, or was this something that came up rather late in the day? Because when you made the IPO in Stockholm, you had finished a phase 2B study of the drug, and that would have taken some time to collect that data. So you obviously had some time in order to prepare for a possible IPO. And was that something that you were doing throughout this early period, was making preparations for a public offering?
So actually, I think that the phase 2B data had already been done and had already been reported out. So actually, when I came in, it was a very typical situation where there were mainly kind of local investors. There were no real kind of specialty investors in the company. And, the remit really was, we're kind of all running out of money, and can we get some money in the next 6 months? So actually, it was a little bit of kind of, driving the car at the same time as you're kind of trying to build it. Which is, the first person obviously I needed to bring on board was the CFO. And so that's really kind of the first person I kind of brought on board. And we started preparing basically for an IPO day one when he arrived.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
So basically this was kind of, we needed to do that. The shareholders did have a choice. I brought forward both a private funded term sheet as well as kind of an IPO kind of. So it was a bit of a, they did have a choice, and ultimately this is the shareholders who decide this. And so the shareholders chose to kind of go down the IPO route in Sweden, which is what we then did.
So should I be surprised that Swedish shareholders would prefer an IPO over, a private equity deal or something like that? Because the IPO in Sweden was followed then by a U.S. listing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so in a sense, you could argue that it was a tiered decision, that taking the first step was essential, and then taking the second step was what really gave you the exposure that you needed. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that it's always, and this is, I'm sure you've all kind of heard this, but I mean, dilution is obviously comes up a fair amount in this industry.
Yeah.
And I guess that there's always going to be a choice in terms of when you see these kind of private term sheets, they have preference shares in. It's a very typical structure. If you look at that versus kind of an IPO, if you're an existing kind of shareholder, you have a tendency maybe to kind of prefer one over the other. But in the long run, obviously, this really was a choice between, do we keep the company private for a longer period of time and then take it directly to NASDAQ? Or do we go through this kind of, tiered process? And is that at the end of the day, is that going to result in more or less dilution? And that can be discussed.
So you mentioned that when you joined the company, the phase 2B data was already there. Tell us a little bit about that data and how it affected your approach to the FDA, because what you wanted to do was to have a phase 3 study with a very unique endpoint. Yeah. And somehow you had to work through that phase B data to show the FDA why you thought that was a good strategy or
Yeah. So in the renal space, so if you look back at kind of like, this is 2017, 2018, if you then looked at the renal space in terms of how much research money was being allocated to renal, if you looked at how many novel therapeutics that actually reached the market in renal, it's a very, very, very depressing reading. There might have been 2 kind of over the last 20 years that's actually kind of come into the market. There has been a lot of lobbying on the FDA to kind of say, at some point, it would be great if you could approve something, right? And so there had been quite a lot of lobbying, and we had spent a lot of work as a company. We got the phase 2b data. It was a large phase 2b trial, 150 patients, first ever kind of phase 2b trial really in this population. It was successful. So it was a large number, it was a large kind of data set. And so with that, together with, quite a lot about the US US kind of academic institutions, kind of US based kind of interest organizations like the NKF, et cetera, and the FDA, there was kind of these meetings to try and see, is there a way that we can come up with some solution to kind of create a regulatory pathway forward here?
And this turned out to be the surrogate endpoint.
Exactly.
And so how long did you have to spend to decide whether that it would be proteinuria or,
So I think that whole process in terms of having all these meetings, looking at all the data, having the interactions, I would say is probably like a 3 to 4 year process.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we see there was a fair amount of time that elapsed between the phase 2b and the start of the phase 3, because really we needed to get to a place where we didn't have to have, 1,000 patients and run some trial for like 5 years, which was just not going to be possible in a rare disease.
But during that period, you had to have financing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So was the IPO successful in that respect? You went to the IPO before you got started the phase 3.
So basically, I think so this was really kind of between, I would say 2014, 2013, 14, and kind of 2017.
Yeah.
So actually, in 2017 was the meeting with the FDA when they then, on the basis of our phase 2b data, publication in American Kidney Journal that looked at this, it was a large statistical analysis that said, okay, there is a reasonably likely probability that reduction in proteinuria may translate into, clinical benefit.
Yeah.
So that kind of was the whole discussion with the regulators, is that could we actually run a pivotal trial on the basis of that reduction in proteinuria, get an accelerated approval on that basis, and then continue to run a trial, a longer-term trial, to then prove that there is this kind of ultimate clinical benefit in translation. So that was kind of the setup with the regulators that we then ultimately got an okay for in kind of 2017.
Yeah. But we haven't talked yet about the actual fact that the product is a generic and the fact that it's already been on the market for asthma, or still is. And what you have done is a unique formulation which takes into account your concept of where the disease starts and how the capsule is released once it's taken. And maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about the formulation. And
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the kind of the root of all of this actually was practicing physicians. So this was a nephrologist and immunologist operating in Uppsala, north of Stockholm, in Sweden. And they actually saw these patients. They had these patients with IgA nephropathy. Obviously, nothing had ever been generated in terms of medication for these patients, a rare disease. But they were kind of all saying, well, why is everyone looking at the kidney? I mean, the kidney is being damaged, but it's kind of an innocent bystander for this process. So why don't we actually try to do something about the origin of the disease and try to actually kind of, be disease modifying rather than just kind of looking at the symptoms? So they came up with this theory and thesis of the fact that, IgA1 is produced in the gut. We should really down-regulate the overproduction of IgA1. And so this is when they went to think about, well, what do we have in terms of almost like topically active kind of substances that have shown to be able to do this previously. Budesonide turned out to obviously be what they then thought about as asthma. It's treating the kind of mucosa in the lung, and this would be treating the mucosa in the gut. So quite a kind of similar context. And the company spent about, I would say, 8 to 10 years really kind of developing this formulation, testing it, because it's actually quite a complicated thing to combine a delayed kind of release with a sustained release that's quite short. So usually you have one or the other, but this actually needed to have both technologies combined. So this actually took a long time to get to the point where not only could we see that we're getting the release in the right place, but it's also stable enough that we can manufacture it, we can reproduce it, et cetera. Because it's certain layers, and it's kind of several components that goes into this product. And so that was kind of the approach.
And during this time, you were building a patent estate.
Exactly.
Quite a patent estate that continued to be built right up through
exactly. So we got
FDA.
actually our last patent, about a year ago. So that patent will now kind of cover the product up until 2043 in the US. So that was, again, actually, it continues to kind of work on product protection so that we can also have somewhat of a kind of life cycle management approach to this.
Yeah. So when Renée and I were chatting last night and this morning, Renée talked a lot about opening up this indication. And what you had after the FDA approval was, suddenly we find out Novartis is doing quite a lot, both with a small molecule that was just given an accelerated approval 2 weeks ago, and now with RNA. And so what do you think, if you look at the terrain, if you look at the landscape, how many new opportunities you think are out there? I mean, besides the one that you've taken.
I mean, I think this is really kind of, I think, fascinating, because obviously the fact that the FDA did kind of ultimately allow for this kind of novel endpoint and the approach of having accelerated approval really meant that, the investment amount into the renal industry has really, really, really grown enormously. So IgA nephropathy is a rare disease, and that might be one thing, a small part of this. But actually, a lot of big pharma, including Astra, Novartis, have really started looking at kind of, the whole kind of CKD landscape in a slightly different way. If they think that they can get, because if the FDA started down this road, obviously the hope is that they'll be able to use that approach in other indications, in other areas within that kind of division. So it has really kind of, provided, I think, a huge amount of hope for a lot of patients living with renal disease. And I think one of the things that's so sad is actually that dialysis obviously has been in place for a very long time. But dialysis has almost been kind of considered as if that's like a good solution. And I think anyone who's been to a dialysis center or actually, really seen what dialysis patients go through, I doubt that they would say that this is a good solution. It's a terrible, terrible situation for these patients to be in. And these patients with IgA nephropathy, they get diagnosed when they're kind of in their 20s, 30s. They're 40 years old, 50 years old, when they're either in need of a transplant or, dialysis. And a lot of times they're much younger than that. So it is really not a solution. And I think that's been, unfortunately, also one of the reasons why you've had some kind of limited investment in renal. Yeah. And so I think this whole kind of opening up of the regulatory framework, and I think it's also now you can see this has now become a way of doing things. We're having conversations again with the FDA. It's having a broad kind of context of conversations regarding FSGS, another kind of rare disease in renal, where again, they're trying to say, is there a different kind of way? It's a similar approach. Is there a framework? Is there statistics? Is there data that can support some kind of way of us moving forward? So at the end of the day, right, it has to be data-driven, right? You have to be able to have enough clinical information, clinical data, statistical analysis and support, and peer-reviewed publications, et cetera, to really put something behind that. You can't just kind of rock up to the FDA and say, I think I have a good idea. So I think that it really does have to be very much data-driven. But I think the great thing is the FDA is now very engaged in this, and they're very interested in trying to kind of find ways of doing it, which is why I think we're seeing a lot more kind of interest. So I do think it's been like, truly revolutionary that, we managed to start that kind of whole opening.
So what about diagnosis? You mentioned that people who eventually get dialysis late in their 40s or 50s possibly have been dealing with this for many, many years. Yeah. What is the age of onset, if there is a typical age of onset? And do we have the diagnostic tools that are sufficient to deal with the problem?
So, I mean, this is obviously one of the issues with renal disease in general, which is that the onset a lot of times can be quite early on in life. And it's hard to know that you have a renal disease in the beginning. You don't have any pain. You don't suddenly have an inflammation. Nothing really occurs. And so the way that actually you'll find out a lot of times that there is a renal impairment is through the fact that you just have a urinary test, right? Yes. And there's protein in your urine, which there shouldn't be. But urinary tests have actually almost disappeared to a large extent in the Western world, right? It's actually super cheap, super simple, but for some reason we don't really do that anymore. Okay. And so actually a lot of times people kind of had a renal disease for a really long time without kind of really knowing it. Because it doesn't, until you actually start getting really fatigued or tired, all of these other things that, might come through. You might have blood in the urine, That's another typical kind of reason why you would kind of go and see your physician and say, this is really odd. But otherwise, if urine is foamy or whatever, you may not think about it. You may not kind of think about the fact that, you have protein in your urine. So it is difficult. But in this IgA nephropathy, it is generally the onset is quite early. It is mainly kind of, I would say in the 20s that, a lot of this happens in people's, in people's lives. But then, of course, the issue is, when do you actually get diagnosed? When do they actually find it? And so what we found is generally that, when people get to a nephrologist, they're usually already in stage 3A, 3B.
I see.
But this is actually, again, I think, which has been fantastic, is because we've had so much kind of interest around IgA nephropathy and this whole regulatory process. A lot of key opinion leaders are quite engaged. They want to have more options. The nephrologists want to have, more things to do than just kind of, off-label, approaches. And so there's been quite a lot of studies now into kind of natural history of these patients. And there's a whole new set of guidelines coming out shortly. The KDIGO guidelines are going to be up there. There's a draft version that's just come out that really is kind of saying, listen, this may take a while for this disease to develop into end-stage renal disease, but you need to treat this now. We need to find these patients earlier. We need to treat them way earlier and much more kind of focused on actually treating the disease and protecting the nephrons than just kind of giving them an ACE and ARB, like blood pressure medication, and saying, well, it'll be fine, we have time, right? Because they don't have time. And I think this is actually one of the things that, again, is really kind of satisfying, I think, to see these patients being taken care of in a much more kind of aggressive way.
Speaking of time, we have just a couple of minutes. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question or two?
Great story, congratulations. I'm just wondering, what was the killing argument to motivate investor in joining your journey in repositioning of a generic drug?
I think that's an excellent question. And actually, I think it is really about telling the story of getting this medication to patients. Less than 10% of everybody's kind of, research projects actually get to patients. And I think when I saw this opportunity, I think that's really what I was driven by. That's what I wanted to do. And at the end of the day, I think investors who came in were investors who, who I think could see the actual kind of ability to kind of do one phase 3 trial, right? Get this accelerated approval and get the product to market and actually kind of drive revenues and drive kind of, acceptance that way. So I think you had to be those investors who came in. I think we're more leaning towards that later stage. This was not a scientifically super exciting kind of platform, but it was something actually that was going to get to patients. And I think that is something that really drove a lot of those investors. And I think, again, we raised, we did an IPO in Europe, we did an IPO in the US. We did several partnering deals to kind of have partners in different kind of commercial areas. So we now have a product that's available in Europe, in China, and in the US, and has gone through that accelerated approval in all of those 3 regions, actually, for the first time ever. And so I think, this is it's going to be a significant, very, very significant revenue generating franchise.
So we're going to have to end, but I'd like everybody to give Renée a big applause.
We have one more question.
Oh, sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
I'm very brief. Great story, congratulations. On patents, IP, there are many companies that are looking in medical need for patients, mostly rare diseases, right? Existing safe drugs. And you made a beautiful story here and success in the end. But how early and how did you tackle IP and intellectual property? Also, EMA and FDA, they also look, are you free to operate? Can you do you not infringe? Can the generics come in immediately? And how did you tackle that? And how did you solve it?
I mean, I think this is really kind of key. I mean, this is one of the other things in terms of, you get a CFO and then you kind of start looking at what can I do about legal and IP. It's a very, very early thing I think you need to focus on. And I think you also need to kind of bring together quite a lot of different kind of skill sets in the company, particularly if you don't have kind of composition of matter. You're going to have to look at kind of, your CMC team, right? Your kind of your differentiation in terms of dosing of, it's all of these. It's actually quite operational. And I think you really have to bring together, several different kind of, disciplines and try and do that quite early. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is you really have to kind of drive through in the whole culture of the whole company that, innovation is key, right? We just have to innovate in a slightly different way. But, think about, and if you get everybody in the organization to think about, we had like early morning breakfast meetings, we had like lunch things, we had Swedish fika, we had all kinds of things to kind of try and tell people, do you have an idea? Have you thought about this? And just if you get the whole company thinking that they can innovate and whatever they can think about can actually be valuable to kind of, continue to build the business, it's amazing what people will come up with. So I think you just have to you have to motivate the people around you. You have to build that kind of culture environment where people are not afraid of kind of coming forward and saying, I've been thinking about this. What do you think about that? And I think that's super key.